A note before this one begins. If you've been with this channel for a while, you know I have a fondness for the ones that sit quietly, the stories that don't shout, that wait for you to lean in. There's an audiobook collection of some of the earliest tales I told, gathered in one place. If that's the kind of thing you keep on while the house goes dark, you'll find a link below. No pressure. It'll be there when you're ready. There are hollows in the Blue Ridge where the timber grows crooked on purpose. You can drive the ridgeline from Roanoke southwest and never see them. The old mountains fold over on themselves, and the roads that used to go through don't go through anymore. People still live in those hollows, or they did. They raised gardens on terraced ground and went to church on Sundays when the circuit preacher came through. But they don't talk about the bells. Not to outsiders. Not to each other, mostly. They just listen. And when midnight comes, they listen a little harder. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. I mean it, wherever you are, whatever room, whatever hour it's become on your side of the world. I read every comment that comes in on these, and it always surprises me how far this voice carries. Some of you write from places I've never heard of, and you tell me about the sounds your grandmother warned you about, the rooms your family wouldn't enter, the wells nobody draws from anymore. I save those. Some of them become stories. This is one of those stories, not from a comment, but from the kind of place those comments always seem to describe. It happened in a hollow called Crayder's Cove, in the Blue Ridge of southwest Virginia. The church there was built in 1843 by a man named Crayder who is otherwise forgotten, and it had 3 bells in its tower, and those bells rang at exactly midnight every night for 27 years. Nobody rang them. The ropes were gone by the 2nd year. The bells rang anyway. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not the ghost of it, the fact of it. 3 bronze bells in a wooden tower, and no hands on the rope, and the sound rolling down the hollow at the exact turn of every night. The way water rolls downhill because it has nowhere else to go. For 27 years. And nobody could say why. And the people who lived with it, the ones who could have left, most of them didn't. Let me tell you about the one who tried to understand it. His name was Eustace Pell. He was 38 years old in the spring of 1898, tall and lean, with a weathered face and dark hair that was thinning at the temples. His eyes were gray-blue, set deep under a heavy brow, and there were lines around his mouth that hadn't been there 2 years before. Lines that came from grief, not from age. He wore a faded brown wool coat and canvas work trousers held up with suspenders, a collarless shirt that he washed on Sundays, and boots he'd resoled himself 3 times. He was a carpenter by trade, and his posture carried the stoop of a man who'd spent years bent over a workbench. His default expression was quiet and watchful, the look of someone who'd learned that paying attention was cheaper than paying for mistakes. When he was thinking, he had a habit of pressing his thumb against the bridge of his nose, as if steadying something behind his eyes. Eustace had come to Crayder's Cove in the autumn of 1896, after his wife, Margaret, died of consumption in Lexington. She was 31. They'd been married 9 years. He couldn't stay in the house where she'd coughed through the last winter of her life, so he packed what he could carry on a mule and took his daughter south into the mountains, where a distant cousin of his mother's had once told him there was land nobody wanted and work for a man who could build things with his hands. The cousin was right about the land. It was a narrow shelf of bottom ground between 2 ridges, with a creek running through it that was clear in the spring and brown in the summer, and the soil was good soil, dark and loamy, the kind that grows beans and corn without complaint. The church sat at the upper end of the hollow, where the ground rose and the timber thickened, and it was the first thing you saw when you came in by the old road, a weathered gray building with a squat tower and a door that stuck. His daughter was Luray. She was 6 when they arrived, small for her age, with light brown hair that Eustace braided every morning in 2 plaits that hung past her shoulders. Her eyes were dark, nearly black, and they took in everything with a stillness that sometimes unsettled the neighbors. She wore a simple calico dress and worn leather boots that had been her mother's as a child, passed down through a cousin, and she hummed when she was nervous, a low, tuneless sound that was less like singing and more like the sound a house makes when it settles. She hummed a lot that first year in Crayder's Cove. She missed her mother in the way that children miss, not with the heavy, ledger-keeping grief of adults, but with a sudden, stabbing absence that came without warning, at odd hours, triggered by a smell or a quality of light that reminded her body of something her mind hadn't yet learned to name. Eustace would find her standing in a doorway, humming, staring at nothing, and he would pick her up and hold her until the humming stopped, and he never said a word about it, because there were no words for it that a 6-year-old should hear. The hollow had maybe 40 people in it when Eustace arrived. They were families who'd been there for generations, Tackets and Groyce and Fens and Sackets, and they were careful with outsiders in the way that mountain people have always been careful. Polite but slow to warm. They let Eustace build his house on the unclaimed shelf, and they brought him work. A new door for the Growy place, a repaired loft beam for the Tacket barn, a coffin for old Asaph Cruz, who'd been the cobbler and who died in the November of Eustace's first winter there. Asaph was 73, thin as a rake, with a long face and wisps of white hair and fingers stained black from decades of leather dye. Eustace built the coffin from cherry boards and didn't charge for it, and that was the thing that opened the hollow to him. People remembered. In a place where money was scarce and neighborliness was the only currency that never depleted, a free coffin built from good wood was a debt that couldn't be repaid in coin. It was repaid in trust. In the slow, grudging admission that the tall man with the deep-set eyes and the dead wife might be one of them, given time. The church was called Crayder's Meeting House, though nobody had called it that in decades. It was just the church. Brother Aldous Fenn, 62, came through every second and fourth Sunday. A gaunt man with white hair and deep-set brown eyes, wearing a black frock coat with a frayed collar, walking with a limp from an old logging injury that had left his left leg shorter than his right. He carried a worn leather Bible with a clasp that didn't close properly, and he preached in a voice that was slow and deliberate, each word placed like a stone in a wall, and his hands trembled when he held the Bible. Not from fear, but from the palsy that ran in his family, the one that had taken his father's hands and his grandfather's before that. He'd been the circuit preacher for the coves between Iron Mountain and the New River for 31 years, and he knew every family in every hollow the way a surveyor knows the contours of land. Not from affection, but from having walked it so many times the shape of it had gotten into his bones. He'd married the Tackets and buried the Groyce and baptized 3 generations of Fens in the creek. He knew the hollow the way a tree knows its own roots, from the inside, from the bottom up. Tilda Growy kept the church. She was 71, short and stout, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp dark eyes that missed nothing. She wore a dark gray dress with a white apron and a shawl that she kept over her shoulders even in the warm months, as if the cold had gotten into her so deep it never left. She moved with a steadiness that surprised people who expected a woman her age to be frail. She hauled water from the spring in 2 wooden buckets, swept the church floor with a broom she made herself from hickory splints, trimmed the wicks on the kerosene lamps, and kept a garden of mustard greens and pole beans behind the churchyard wall. When she recalled dates, she counted on her fingers, touching each one to her thumb, and she was never wrong. She had been the church custodian since 1859, when she was 32, and she had been listening to the bells for longer than anyone else alive. She had buried a husband and 2 children in the churchyard. She had outlived the man who built the church, the man who tried to stop the bells, and most of the people who'd ever heard them. She was the hollow's memory, a woman with a broom and a garden and a shawl that never came off. Because here is what Eustace did not know when he came to Crayder's Cove. The bells rang. Every night. At midnight. Not on Sundays, not for services, not for weddings or funerals or the calling of the faithful. At midnight. In the dark. And they had been doing it since 1871, the year the church's founder, the forgotten man Crayder, was found dead in the bell tower with his hand still on the largest bell's rope. He was cold. He'd been dead for hours. But the bell was still warm, and it was still ringing, and nobody had pulled it. That first night, Eustace heard the bells and thought someone was calling the faithful for an emergency. A fire, a birth gone wrong, a death. He sat up in bed. Luray stirred beside him but didn't wake. He listened. 3 bells in sequence, the largest first, then the middle, then the smallest, and each one ringing clear and full, the way bronze rings when it's struck properly, with a mallet or a rope, with force and intent. The sound came down the hollow like something walking, and it lasted for, he counted, nearly a full minute. Then it stopped. Not faded. Stopped. As if a hand had been lifted from a rope. He got up and looked at the clock he'd set on the mantel. It said 12:03. He'd heard the bells starting, he was certain, right at 12. He went back to bed. He didn't think about it again until the next night, when it happened again. And the next. And the next. By the fourth night, Eustace was waiting for it. He sat in a chair by the window with a kerosene lamp turned low and watched the dark shape of the church up the hollow. The night was still. No wind. The creek made its usual sound. A low, steady muttering over the rocks, and the dogs in the hollow were quiet. He could see the church tower against the sky, a black square against the deeper black of the timber behind it, and he watched it the way a man watches a stove he's not sure is cold. At midnight the bells came, the largest first, then the middle, then the smallest. The same sequence, the same duration, the same full, clear tone. And from his window, in the dark, Eustace could see the tower. And the bells were moving. He could see them, barely, just the suggestion of movement. The dark shapes of the bells swinging in the tower's open arches. They were moving. 3 bells swinging, ringing, as if someone were pulling the ropes. On the 5th day, he went up to the church in the afternoon. Tilda Growy was sweeping the front steps. She was 71, short and stout, silver hair in a tight bun, sharp dark eyes, her shawl over her shoulders despite the mild spring air. She looked at him and then looked at the tower and then back at him, and she said, "You heard them." It wasn't a question. "I heard them," Eustace said. "Every night since we arrived." "Who rings them?" Tilda counted on her fingers, index to thumb, middle to thumb, and said, "Nobody's rung them in 26 years. Not since Crayder died. The ropes are gone. The ropes rotted out in 73. I didn't replace them. There was no call to." Eustace looked up at the tower. The 3 bells hung in their frame, still and dark. There were no ropes. The clappers hung free. He could see the empty spaces where ropes had once been tied to the clapper levers, worn spots on the wood, but nothing there now. Just iron and bronze and silence. "Then how do they ring?" he said. Tilda looked at him the way she looked at everything, steadily, without surprise, as if she'd been answering this question from newcomers for decades and had long since run out of urgency about it. "They ring," she said, "every night. 12. They've rung since the night Crayder died. I was 32. I'm 71. You do the math. 3 bells, no hands." He didn't sleep that night. He went up to the church at 11 and climbed the tower ladder. The rungs were hand-hewn oak, worn smooth by decades of feet, and they creaked under his weight in the dark. The bells hung above him in their frame, and he put his hand on the largest one. It was cold. The bronze was cold to the touch, the way metal is cold on a spring night. Not wrong, just cold. He kept his hand on it. He waited. At midnight, the bell rang under his hand. He felt it. He felt the vibration, the deep resonance that a struck bell sends through the metal, through the frame, through the wood of the tower. His hand buzzed with it. His bones buzzed with it. The bell was ringing. He could feel it, but he could not see it move. The bell was still. His hand was on it. The bronze hummed under his palm like a living thing, and the sound filled the hollow. He could hear it rolling down the valley, the same full, clear tone, the same sequence, but the bell was not moving. He pressed harder. He wrapped both hands around the rim. He held it with everything he had. The bell rang. His hands burned with the vibration. The bell did not move. 3 bells, no hands. The sound came from metal that was still. He climbed down shaking. He sat on the church steps and put his head in his hands, and he pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose, and he breathed until his breathing was the only sound he could hear. Then he went home. Lorraine was still asleep. He sat by her bed and watched her breathe until dawn. Over the next 10 days, Eustace did what a carpenter does when something doesn't make sense. He measured. He checked the bell frame for hidden mechanisms, wires, pulleys, counterweights, anything that a clever man might have built into the tower to make the bells ring without hands. He found nothing. The frame was hand-hewn oak, pegged, not nailed, and it was original to the church's construction. He checked the tower walls for gaps or vents that might carry sound from elsewhere. A cave, a hollow, another church in the next cove. The tower was solid. He checked the ground beneath the church for hollows or chambers that might amplify resonance from the creek or the wind. The ground was packed clay and stone, solid, no hollows. He measured the distance from the tower to his house, 430 paces. He timed the bells against his mantel clock. They began within 15 seconds of midnight and lasted 52 seconds. Every night, the same. Everything was where it should be and nothing explained the sound. On the 8th day he went to see Orville Sackett. Orville was 44, a tinsmith who'd also taken up surveying when the county needed men to run chains for the new road surveys. He was stocky, red-haired with a close-cropped beard, and his hands were broad and calloused from working sheet metal. He wore a leather apron over his work clothes and kept a surveyor's chain and a level hung on pegs behind his forge. He was a practical man, skeptical by nature, the kind who trusted what he could measure and distrusted what he couldn't, and he said so freely, which made him either the most honest man in the hollow or the most stubborn, depending on who you asked. Eustace told him about the bells. Orville listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When Eustace finished, Orville said, "You held the bell and it rang but didn't move. I held it with both hands. And it didn't move. It vibrated. It hummed. But it didn't swing. The clapper didn't strike. I could feel the sound in the metal, but the metal was still." Orville wiped his hands on his apron. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'll come tonight." They went up together. Orville brought his surveyor's level and a tin sheet and a length of wire. At 11:30, they climbed the tower. Orville set the level on the bell frame and adjusted it until the bubble was centered. He hung the tin sheet from a nail so that it just touched the largest bell's rim. If the bell swung even a quarter inch, the sheet would rattle. He tied the wire to the clapper and ran it through a hole in the tower floor, down to where he stood below so he could feel any movement in the clapper through the wire. At midnight, the bells rang. Orville stood below, holding the wire. It didn't move. The wire was still in his hand. The tin sheet didn't rattle. The level's bubble stayed centered. And the sound, the full, clear, bronze ringing of 3 bells, poured out of the tower and down the hollow as it had every night for 26 years. Orville came down from the tower and sat on the church steps next to Eustace. He held the wire in his hands and looked at it. He looked at the tin sheet, which was still. He looked at the level, which was still centered. "I can't explain it," he said. "Can you check the bells themselves?" Eustace said, "The metal, whether they're real, whether they're whole." Orville came back the next afternoon with a magnifying lens and a set of calipers. He measured each bell, the circumference at the rim, the thickness at the crown, the weight by hefting them against known weights on a balance scale. They were real bronze. They were whole. No cracks, no seams, no hidden chambers or false walls. They were bells. They were meant to ring. And they were ringing, every night at midnight, with no hands on them and no movement in the metal. 3 bells, no hands. 3 bells, no hands. The phrase lodged in Eustace's mind the way a splinter lodges in a finger, small, sharp, impossible to ignore. He said it to himself while he planed boards. He said it to himself while he braided Louret's hair in the morning. He said it to himself in the dark, waiting for midnight, when the sound came again, faithful as a heartbeat, and the bells in the tower did not move. The dogs had started to change. Eustace noticed it on the 10th night. The 2 hounds belonging to the Tackett family. Dogs that had always slept through the night, that would barely lift their heads for a coyote, began to howl at midnight. Not at the bells. Before the bells. They began to howl at 11:55, and they howled until the bells started, and then they went silent. Not quiet, silent, as if the sound of the bells was preferable to whatever they were hearing before it. Eustace's own mule, in its shed, began to press itself against the far wall every night at the same time. And the birds, the whippoorwills that called all night in the hollow through the spring and summer, went quiet at midnight. All of them, at the same instant, and stayed quiet for the 52 seconds the bells rang. Then they started again, as if something had clamped a hand over the hollow and lifted it, 52 seconds later, and the birds resumed their calling as though nothing had happened, as though the silence had been a thing imposed on them rather than a thing they chose. It was Tilda Growy who told him what she knew. He went to her on the 12th day, in the afternoon, and found her in the churchyard, setting out mustard green seedlings in a row behind the low stone wall. She was 71, and she moved with that steadiness. Knees bent, back straight, hands sure in the soil. She didn't look up when he came through the gate. "You're gonna ask me why," she said. "If you know." "I know what Crayder's daughter told me. She was alive when I was a girl. She died in 81 and she was past 90, and she was clear in her mind to the last." Tilda pressed a seedling into the ground and patted the soil around it. Crayder built the church in 43. He built the tower and hung the bells himself, cast them in a foundry in Roanoke, hauled them up on a timber frame with oxen. 3 bells. He said they were for calling the faithful. But his daughter said he built them for something else. She said he'd made a promise to someone. She didn't know who, she didn't know what, that the bells would ring at the turning of every night, and that as long as they rang, something in the hollow would stay where it was put. Eustace stood very still. What was in the hollow? Tilda counted on her fingers. She touched her index finger to her thumb, her middle finger to her thumb. She was counting years, not things. She said her father never told her what. She said he only told her the bells would hold it, and that the bells had to ring at midnight, and that no one should ever stop them. She said he told her this the night before he died, and she thought he was rambling. He was an old man by then, past 70, and his mind wandered. But the next morning they found him in the tower, and the bells were ringing, and she understood he hadn't been rambling at all. Could they be stopped? Tilda looked at him then. Her sharp dark eyes, her tight silver bun, her shawl over her shoulders. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a child who has asked to touch the stove. Crayder's son tried. In 71. He came home from the war. He'd been gone since 62, fighting for Virginia, and he didn't believe his sister. He was a hard man, Crayder's son. A soldier. He went up the tower on a Sunday afternoon and he wrapped the clappers in rags and he tied the bells fast with rope so they couldn't move, and he came down and said there would be no more ringing in this hollow. What happened? That was the night Crayder died. They found him in the tower, his hand on the rope, cold for hours, and the bells ringing. The rags were gone. The rope was gone, and the bells were ringing. She went back to her seedlings. She pressed another into the soil, and her hands were steady, and her voice was steady, and the only thing that wasn't steady was the way she paused. Just for a moment, just long enough for Eustace to notice, before she said the next words. "I've listened to them for 26 years, she said. "I don't go up the tower at night. I don't touch the bells. I open the church door at midnight and I stand in the doorway and I listen, and when they stop, I close the door and I go to bed. That's all I do. That's all anyone here does. And in 26 years, has anyone tried to stop them again?" Tilda pressed another seedling into the soil. "No," she said. "Nobody here is that foolish. We mind our business. The bells mind theirs." Eustace pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose. He stood there for a long time, watching Tilda Growy plant her garden in the shadow of the bell tower, and the tower was quiet in the afternoon light, and the 3 bells hung in their frame, and they were still, and they were waiting. Have you ever known in your body that something was wrong? Not in your mind. Your mind can talk itself into or out of anything. I mean in your body. The way your stomach tightens before you see the thing that frightened you. The way your hands go cold before you hear the sound. The way the way an animal knows that the shape of the place you're standing in has changed, even though nothing has moved. If you've felt that, the body knowing what the mind won't admit, then you know something of what Eustace Pell was carrying up that hollow, toward the church, toward the tower, toward the bells that rang without hands. And if you have a story like that, a time your body knew before your mind did, tell me in the comments. I read every one. Some of them become the next stories I tell. Let's go back to the story. Eustace made a plan. He was a carpenter, and carpenters plan. They measure twice, they cut once, they work in daylight because daylight is honest and the dark is not. He would bring Orville Sackett and the tinsmith's phonograph, a Columbia graphophone with a wax cylinder, the kind Orville had bought the year before from a traveling salesman in Wytheville, up to the church on a Sunday afternoon. They would set it in the tower. They would run the recording horn toward the bells. They would wait for midnight in daylight's company, with the sun still up, and they would leave before dark. They would record the bells and play back the cylinder in the morning, in Orville's shop in full light, where they could think clearly about what they heard. Careful plan. A daylight plan. The kind of plan a man makes when he wants to understand something without standing inside it. They set the date for Sunday, the 14th of May. Orville cleaned the graphophone and packed fresh wax cylinders in a wooden box lined with felt. Eustace told Luray he'd be working late at the church and that Mrs. Tackett would sit with her. He told Tilda what they were doing, and Tilda looked at him with those sharp dark eyes and said nothing, which was worse than anything she could have said. He told Brother Fen, who was coming through that Sunday, and the old preacher sat in his chair and held his trembling hands in his lap and said, "Some sounds are not meant to be captured, Eustace. Some sounds are meant to be heard and let go." Eustace thanked him and did not take the advice. On the evening of Saturday, the 13th of May, the bells rang early. Not at midnight, at 11:47. Eustace was in his workshop, finishing a door frame for the growy place, when the sound came. He dropped his plane. He stood up. The bells were ringing, the same 3 bells, the same sequence, the same full bronze tone, but it was 13 minutes early. 13 minutes. He'd been counting the time for weeks. He knew the bells the way he knew the grain of wood, by feel, by habit, by the accumulated certainty of repetition. And they were early. He went to the window. The light was still on in the sky. A late spring dusk, the ridge still visible against a band of orange and purple. The bells rang in the last light. They had never done that. In 26 years they had rung in full dark. Always at midnight. Always in the black. And now they were ringing in the dusk, with the sky still holding color, and the sound rolled down the hollow and found him in his workshop, and it was the same sound, the same bells, but it felt wrong the way a word feels wrong when it's spoken in the wrong room. The same word, the same mouth, but the walls are different and the meaning changes. The dogs in the hollow began to howl. But this time they didn't stop when the bells started. They kept howling. The sound was wrong. Not the clean, fearful howling of dogs that sense something in the woods, but a thin, reedy sound, almost like whimpering, as if the animals were in pain. Eustace's mule was kicking the wall of its shed, and he could hear the boards cracking. And the whippoorwills had gone silent an hour before, at dusk, and hadn't started again. The whole hollow had gone wrong at once, as if the early bells had loosened something that the midnight bells had been holding in place. The bells stopped after 52 seconds. The same duration, but the silence after was different. Pressed. It had weight. Eustace stood at his window and felt the silence like a hand on his chest, and he knew, in his body, not his mind, that the plan was gone. The daylight plan. The careful plan. The plan that kept them in the sun and out of the dark. It was gone. He went to Luray's room. She was sitting up in bed, wide awake, humming, the low, tuneless sound. She was 6, small for her age, light brown hair in 2 braids that had come loose in sleep, her dark eyes wide and fixed on the window. "Papa," she said, "they rang too early. I know. Something's coming." He didn't ask her what she meant. He picked her up and carried her to Mrs. Tackett's house, down the hollow, and left her there with a promise to come back before morning. Mrs. Tackett was 58, a heavy woman with a kind face and flour on her apron, and she took Luray without a word and set her by the fire with a cup of warm milk. Then Eustace went to Orville's forge. Orville was already outside, holding the graphophone in its case, his red hair lit by the lamp from his doorway. He was 44, stocky, his broad hands gripping the case. His face had the look of a man whose skepticism has been challenged by something that doesn't care about skepticism. "They rang early," Eustace said. "I know. I heard. We go now." Orville looked at the sky. It was nearly dark. The orange band had narrowed to a thread on the ridge. "The plan was daylight," he said. "The plan is gone." They went up the hollow in the dark. Orville carried the graphophone and the cylinders. Eustace carried a kerosene lamp and a hammer, though he didn't know why he'd brought the hammer. It wasn't the kind of problem a hammer could fix. The night was warm and wrong. The creek sounded louder than it should have. The dogs had stopped howling, and the silence they left behind was worse than the howling had been. The air smelled of turned earth and something else. Something mineral, something cold. The smell of a root cellar opened after years. The church was a dark shape above them, and the tower was a darker shape against the sky, and the bells were still. They climbed the tower. The rungs creaked under their weight. Orville set the graphophone on the floor of the tower, between the bells, and aimed the recording horn at the largest bell. He threaded a fresh wax cylinder onto the mandrel and set the stylus. He cranked the spring motor. He looked at Eustace. Eustace looked at the clock he'd brought and set on the tower floor. It said 11:51. They waited. At 11:53 the dog started again, the thin, reedy howling worse than before. Eustace's mule screamed somewhere down the hollow, a sound he'd never heard an animal make. The whippoorwills were silent. The air in the tower was cold. Not spring cold, but a deep, still cold, the kind that belongs to cellars and caves and places that don't see the sun. Eustace could see his breath. Orville could see his. The cold was coming from the bells. Not from outside, not from the night air, but from the bronze itself, as if the metal had opened a door to somewhere that had never been warm. At midnight the bells rang, but not the way they had rung before. The sound came, and it was bronze, and it was full, and it was the same sequence, largest, middle, smallest, but underneath the ringing, beneath it, woven through it like a thread through cloth, there was something else. A voice. Not a bell's voice. A human voice. It was low, and it was quiet, and it was coming from the bells, from the metal, from the bronze that was not moving, and Eustace could not make out the words, but he could make out the tone of someone calling a name. Calling it the way you call someone in from the dark. The way you call someone you love and expect to lose. Orville's hand was on the graphophone crank. The cylinder was turning. The stylus was cutting. He could hear it too. His face had gone white under his red beard, and his broad hands were trembling on the machine. The bells rang for 52 seconds. Then they stopped. The cold lifted. The dogs went silent. The whippoorwills started again, one by one, as if they were being released from something. Eustace and Orville sat in the tower and didn't speak. The graphophone's cylinder turned for another few seconds, recording silence, and then Orville stopped it. He pulled the cylinder off the mandrel and held it in his hands like something fragile and dangerous. "Did you hear?" Eustace started. "Don't," Orville said. "Not here. Not now. We take it to the shop. We play it in the light." They played the cylinder in Orville's shop the next morning, in full daylight, with the doors open and the spring sun on the floorboards. Orville set the graphophone on his workbench, fitted the cylinder, set the reproducer, and cranked the motor. Eustace stood by the door. He was 38, tall and lean, his gray-blue eyes fixed on the machine, his thumb pressed against the bridge of his nose. The cylinder played. They heard the bells, the same sound, preserved in wax, the bronze ringing clear and full, the sequence perfect, largest to smallest. And they heard the voice. It was clearer on the recording than it had been in the tower. It was a woman's voice. It was low, and it was calm, and it was saying a name. It was saying it over and over, the way you say a name when you're calling someone home, and the name was Margit. Margit. Eustace's wife's name. The woman who had died of consumption in Lexington, who had never been to Crayder's Cove, who had never heard these bells, who had been buried in a cemetery 200 miles north of the hollow. Margit. 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 The recording was 52 seconds long. The bells rang for 52 seconds. The voice spoke the name for 52 seconds. When it ended, the wax cylinder hissed with empty groove, and Orville lifted the reproducer, and the shop was quiet except for the sound of the creek outside and the birds in the trees. Eustace didn't speak. He pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose, and his hand was shaking. Orville played the cylinder again, and a fourth time. Each time the bells. Each time the voice. Each time the name. "This is a recording of bells," Orville said slowly. "I recorded bells." The horn was pointed at the bells. There was nothing else in the tower. No person. No other sound source. And the cylinder has captured a voice saying a name. He looked at Eustace. "Is that your wife's name?" Eustace nodded. Orville set the cylinder down on the bench. He wrapped it in a cloth and put it in the wooden box and closed the lid. "I can't explain this," he said. "I'm a tinsmith. I measure things. I check things. I've checked the bells. They're bells. I've checked the tower. It's a tower. I've checked the recording. It's a recording of bells that contains a voice that shouldn't be there. I can't explain it, and I'm not going to try. In the weeks that followed, Orville sent the cylinder to a man he knew in Roanoke, an engineer named Percival Hoyt who worked for the Norfolk and Western Railway and who had experience with recording equipment, having installed the graphophones in the railway offices for dictation. Percival Hoyt was 50, a lean man with spectacles and a careful manner, and he examined the cylinder, the graphophone, the recording mechanism. He wrote back. His letter was brief and careful, written in the hand of a man accustomed to technical reports. He confirmed that the cylinder was a standard wax cylinder, properly recorded, with no evidence of tampering or overdubbing. He confirmed that the recording contained bell sounds and what appeared to be a human voice. He confirmed that the voice was not an artifact of the recording process, not mechanical noise, not stylus skipping, not resonance from the horn. He could not explain the presence of the voice. He could not identify the source. He recommended that the cylinder be preserved and that no further recordings be attempted. He closed the letter with a sentence that Eustace would remember for the rest of his life. I have been an engineer for 22 years, and I have never encountered a phenomenon that I could not at least hypothesize about. I can offer no hypothesis here. The recording is genuine. I cannot say what it is a recording of. The cylinder was real. The voice was real. The bells were real. And none of them belonged together in any way that a tinsmith, a carpenter, or a railway engineer could account for. The impossibility was confirmed. It was not explained. It was not debunked. It was confirmed by a machine, by a recording, by a man in Roanoke who had no stake in the outcome and no reason to lie. The bells rang without hands, and when they rang, they carried a voice that should not have existed, speaking the name of a woman who had never been to the hollow, and the modern world, the world of graphophones and railway engineers and wax cylinders, could not make it stop and could not make it make sense. 3 bells, no hands. And underneath, a voice. And the voice knew his wife's name. Eustace did not leave Crayder's Cove. He thought about it, God, he thought about it. In the nights after the recording, he lay awake and calculated the distance to Lexington, the cost of a mule and provisions, the logistics of taking Luray back to the world where bells rang because people pulled ropes and voices belonged to living mouths. But every time he came close to packing, he thought of the voice. Margaret's name, spoken from bronze, carried through the hollow at midnight. And he thought, if I leave, who listens? If I leave, who stands in the doorway and hears her? Because that was what it was. That was what he couldn't say to Orville or to Tilda or to anyone. The voice in the bells was not a haunting. It was not a threat. It was a woman calling a name, his wife's name. And Eustace Pell, who had carried his grief 200 miles into the mountains and built a house on a shelf of unwanted ground, could not bring himself to leave the only place where he still heard her voice. He did not go up the tower again. He followed Tilda Growe's example. Every night, at 5 minutes to midnight, he walked up the hollow to the church, and he opened the church door, and he stood in the doorway, and he listened. The bells rang. The voice spoke. And Eustace stood in the threshold between the dark church and the dark hollow, and he listened to his dead wife's name spoken from 3 bells that did not move, and he did not go inside, and he did not go up the tower, and when the bells stopped, he closed the door and went home. This became his ritual. Every night, rain or clear, winter or summer, he walked up the hollow, opened the door, stood in the threshold, listened, closed the door, walked home. The neighbors saw him do it. They didn't ask. They had their own rituals, their own ways of listening, their own doors they opened or didn't open, their own reasons for staying in a hollow where the bells rang at midnight and nobody could say why. Luray grew. She was 6 when they arrived, and by the time she was 12, she was tall and quiet, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's watchful expression. She stopped humming when she was nervous and started braiding her own hair, and she went to the church school when Brother Fenn came through, and she learned to read and write and do sums, and by the time she was 16 she was teaching the younger children herself. She heard the bells every night of her childhood. She never went up the tower. She never asked her father what he heard in the doorway. She knew the way children know things, not by being told, but by living close to someone who carries a weight and learning the shape of it without needing to lift it. Brother Eustace Fenn died in the winter of 1912. He was 76. He'd been the circuit preacher for 45 years, and he died in the saddle literally. They found him on the road between Iron Mountain and the New River, his horse standing patient in the snow, his body cold, his hands still on the reins, his worn leather Bible in the saddlebag. They brought him to Crayder's meeting house, and Eustace built his coffin from cherry boards, the same wood he'd used for old Asaph Cruz 14 years before, and they buried him in the churchyard beside the mustard greens. After that, no circuit preacher came through regularly. The denominations were thinning. The roads were bad. The hollow was losing people the way hollows do, one family at a time, one generation at a time, the young ones going down the mountain to the towns where there was work and light and bells that rang only when someone pulled them. Tilda Growy died in the spring of 1919. She was 90. She was found in the church, in her usual chair, her shawl over her shoulders, her silver hair still in its tight bun. She'd been dead since midnight. The bells had rung. She'd been sitting in the church when they rang. Not in the doorway but inside, in her chair, as if she'd decided, at the end, to let the sound be the last thing she heard. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was calm. Eustace built her coffin too. He was 59 now, his hair more gray than dark, his stoop deeper, his hands still sure but slower. He buried her beside Brother Fen, beside the mustard greens that still came up every spring, and after that, he was the only one who kept the church. The bells rang. Every night. At midnight. 27 years from the night Crayder died. 27 years of a man walking up a hollow, opening a door, standing in a threshold, listening for his wife's name in bronze, closing the door, walking home. And then, on the night of October the 3rd, 1898, no, let me be precise. On the night of October the 3rd, 1925, 27 years to the night since Eustace had first heard the bells in the spring of 1898, which was 27 years from 1871, the night Crayder died, the night the bells began, the bells did not ring. Eustace was in the doorway. He was 65. He was old now, thin, weathered, his gray-blue eyes dimmed with age, his dark hair gone to white. His stoop so deep he seemed to be leaning into a wind that wasn't there. He stood in the threshold at midnight, as he had for 27 years, and he waited. And the hollow was silent. The bells did not ring. The voice did not speak. The dogs did not howl. The whippoorwills called through the dark without interruption. The creek muttered over its rocks. And that was all. He stood in the doorway for an hour. Then he closed the door. He walked home. And the next night he walked up the hollow again, and he opened the door, and he stood in the threshold, and the bells did not ring. And the next night, and the next. He kept the ritual for 11 more years, until the fall of 1936, when his legs would no longer carry him up the hollow. By then the church was falling in. The roof sagging, the tower leaning, the door swollen shut with damp. Luray had married a man from Wytheville, a printer named Samuel Darnell, and moved down the mountain in 1920, and she came to see her father when she could, which was not often, because the roads were bad and the hollow was hard to reach. She was 38 the year the bells stopped. She came up once that winter and found her father sitting by the fire, and she said, "Papa, they stopped." He looked at her. He pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose. "I know," he said. "I still go. I still open the door." "Why?" He was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, the creek muttered in the dark. "Because she might call again," he said. "And someone should be there to hear." Eustace Pell died in the winter of 1937. He was 77. He died in his sleep in the house he'd built on the shelf of unwanted ground, and Luray came up the hollow one last time and found him, and she buried him in the churchyard beside Tilda Growy and Brother Fen and old Asaph Cruz, beside the mustard greens that still came up every spring. She built no coffin. She was not a carpenter, but she found the cherry door frame he'd made for the Growy place, the one he'd been finishing the night the bells rang early, and she laid it across his grave as a marker, and it's there still if you know where to look. Cherry would last. It lasts longer than the man who shaped it, longer than the woman he shaped it for, longer than the bells that called her name. After Eustace died, Luray kept the ritual. Not in Crayder's Cove. She lived in Wytheville, in a house with a front door that opened onto a paved street, and there were no bells in her town that rang at midnight. But every night, for the rest of her life, she opened her front door at 5 minutes to 12, and she stood in the threshold and she listened. Not for the bells. For the voice. For her mother's name, spoken from somewhere she couldn't see. In a tone she recognized but had never heard in life. She stood there for 52 seconds. The same duration the bells had rung. The same length she'd counted as a child lying awake in a hollow that rang with bronze and grief. And then she closed the door and went to bed. She did this until she died in 1954, at the age of 64. Her children found her in the doorway, in her nightclothes, the front door open, the December wind in her hair. She was smiling. The church is still there. Or what's left of it. The walls, mostly, and the stone foundation, and the bell tower, leaning but standing, the 3 bells still in their frame. The hollow is empty of people now. The road that used to go through doesn't go through. The gardens are gone. The creek still runs, clear in the spring and brown in the summer. And hikers, the occasional ones who find the old road and follow it up the ridge, the ones who come looking for the church that doesn't appear on the county maps anymore, report hearing bells at midnight. Not often, not every night, but sometimes. 3 bells, in sequence, largest to smallest. A sound rolling down a hollow where no one lives and no one rings and no one stands in a doorway anymore to listen. I want to ask you something. If a place held something for you, a voice, a name, a sound that shouldn't exist but does, how long would you keep the door open? How many nights would you walk up the hollow? And if the sound stopped, would you stop too? Or would you keep going, keep listening, keep opening the door on the chance that it might come back? Tell me your stories. The ones your grandmother told you about, the places your family wouldn't go. The sounds nobody talks about. The doors that open at night. I read every one, and some of them, the ones that ring true, the ones that have that weight to them, they become the next stories I tell. It might just become the next story I tell. There's a story I've been sitting with about a bridge in the Cumberland Gap that a surveyor's chain couldn't measure. A bridge that was shorter going across than it was going back. I'll tell that one soon. Mind the ringing.